It was time to finish the inside of the porch. The intention with the design of the porch was always to make a little bench where you could take your muddy shoes off before coming into the house. So when I chopped up the old beam that used to be under the porch for my saw bench, I kept some of it aside for this project, as it seemed like a nice idea to carry some of the history through in the porch's new iteration. I suggested using the timber to Lily, and she liked the idea, but her top concern was making sure that it wouldn't snag our clothes when we sat down on it. I said we could fill the cracks with epoxy, and she wasn't too keen on that idea. So instead she suggested that we could patch over the cracks, like we watched Laura Kampf doing with her floorboards recently. It seemed like a lot of work, especially without the CNC router, but I liked the idea enough to give it a shot. With the beam chopped into 4 boards, I got 3 of them biscuited and glued together, which left me with 1 extra board from which to scavenge clear material for the patches. I made a simple jig out of scrap wood and used that with a follow-along bit in the router, and made old Mr. Hitachi once again work a bit harder than he ever intended. After routing 1 section out, I tidied up the corners by hand, then glued the first patch panel in. It seemed like it was going to work, so before doing any more, I planed it back and it looked really good. Then it became a matter of rinsing and repeating until the crack sections got ever smaller. And I couldn't avoid figuring out what to do about the big knot in the front edge. I cut a slightly wedge-shaped piece to go in it, then used that piece as a guide to match the angle on the main board. And after a bit of finessing, it went about as well as I could have hoped. I eventually got to a point where the remaining cracks were as small as the seams I was introducing with my patches, which was a good point to stop. Because I still had these fine cracks and seams though, I ended up using a little epoxy after all. Once it's set, I found a cabinet scraper was an effective way of scraping away the excess. Then repeated the process a couple more times until there were no gaps at all. I went a bit overkill and sanded the underside down with a flap disc on my angle grinder, which was very effective in evening out some of the lumps and inaccurate seams. And also was a good reminder of just how many cracks I'd patched up in the top side over the past couple of weeks. Next was time to do the worst bit, which was cutting it down to fit. I glued together a template out of cardboard, which gave me a good approximation to start with. But it still took, I think, 12 trips back to the workshop to finesse it before it finally dropped in, causing a lot of damage along the way to the newly plastered walls and over-optimistic first couple of coats of paint I just put on them. Once it fit into the gap, I screwed a couple of battens to the wall to support the bench. It took a little tinkering here too to get the bench to sit as level as possible on them. But I got there in the end. I gave the battens, and all the scratches I made in the walls fitting the bench, a quick coat of paint, and it was looking good again. I ended up confirming that this was most likely oak by the fact that my fingers kept turning purple whenever I worked on it. This was a useful insight to make for the sake of finishing. I didn't really want it to turn deep golden like traditional oak. So I ordered a sample pot of whitening primer and some so-called dead flat varnish, which after a few coats of each ended up looking really good. It barely looks different to how it was before I put any finish on it. But I'm sure it's much more durable now. The timber I used for the windowsills came with this groove cut in the back of them, which I think makes more sense on bigger constructions than my tiny porch. They wouldn't have been much good to lean back on anyway, so I had an idea to make some bolsters that could clip into these grooves. I screwed a couple of scrap strips of wood to a little ply, which gave me a surface to slot into the windowsill. I got some upholstery foam and did some more questionable table sawing.
Pretty well, actually.
Which actually went pretty well, and Lily ordered some Harris tweed all the way from the Hebrides. And then it was just a matter of stapling it together. And slotting it back into the windowsill, which also worked pretty well. With the bench done, I still had a little of the oak left over, so I set about making a couple of coat hooks from it. I sketched out a shape on the side of this chunk, then did some maybe questionable cuts on the table saw to rough them out. I then gave them a good hand sanding to smooth over all the edges. Then put a dual tip screw into the back of each one to allow me to attach them to the wall. They then got the same finish as the bench top, and once the finish was dry, we agreed on positioning.
No, I think it's perfect.
And popped a couple of holes in the wall. The first one went in perfectly, but the gods of threaded rotation didn't smile on me twice in a row, because getting it tight enough and the right way up ended up chewing the wall and paint up again. A bit more filler and paint tidied that up though. The other big part of finishing the porch was the floor. We found some tiles we liked and it became a saga to get hold of them. But after a few weeks of calling around, I finally had enough to get the job done. They came in single colour sheets with bigger grout gaps than we wanted, so in a fashion typical of us, we ended up doing what we thought was doing the job properly, and spent a couple of days washing the glue off every single tile before we laid them. Cutting these tiles was the next daunting process. With these tiny porcelain tiles, I ended up finding that my glass cutting tool was much more accurate than the tile cutter I bought, especially for cutting the triangular pieces I needed to form the border. But with a bit of modification, the cutter was still useful for snapping them once scored. They always say that with decorating, 90% of the work is the preparation, and this was no exception. With the tiles mostly ready, I prepared for preparing the surface preparations by sweeping and washing the floor. Then I primed it with some PVA, and once that was dry enough, I was ready to finally prepare the floor with some self-levelling screed. The compound worked way better than I was expecting, though it took a lot more of it to level the floor than I expected in this tiny porch. It gave a nice smooth surface to tile against, and it was pretty satisfying watching the little bubbles burst. The compound dried pretty quickly, and I decided the best thing to do would be to mark out the pattern on the floor before starting to tile. This was a real puzzle in such a confined space. I ended up cutting a straight edge on another scrap of ply, then cutting the scrap down each time I needed it a bit shorter. The markings ended up being pretty much no help at all once I got the adhesive on the floor, but I guess it was a good sanity check. On the subject of the adhesive, I first bought a bag of quick setting material, not quite appreciating how little 15 minutes of working time was when I had about 500 tiny tiles to lay. I managed to get the first 3 rows down, which was needlessly stressful, before I went and got a bag of standard set instead, which had a much more practical 8-hour working time. Starting with the fast setting worked out pretty well though. It gave us a few rows down the middle that weren't sliding around to work against, and it gave Lily an opportunity to tell me that she thought she could do better at getting them level and straight. I conceded the job to her for the afternoon, and while she did do a lovely job, the working in the tight space aggravated an injury, and I was eventually subbed back in so we could get the job finished. It was a bit easier to be patient with the standard setting adhesive, and after a few days of on and off work, I got the main field done. The border was more of a fiddle as it was right up against the walls, and it required the edge tiles to be cut on the fly, as well as negotiating wobbly triangles everywhere. I got to a point though where I was so close to finishing that I ended up working pretty late into the night to get it done. I think we ended up doing a pretty good job of laying these tiles, all things told. Everything looked pretty darn straight, and pretty level too. So next came the best bit of the tiling job, which was grouting it. I put together a little sample piece out of some of the offcuts, which I used as a trial run for the grouting and to make sure it wasn't going to stain the tiles at all. With the reassurance of it going well, I got to work on the porch floor. It was going really well until about a third of the way through, when I heard a dreaded clink sound
Oh no.
and found that a tile hadn't taken to the adhesive. This wasn't the first one we discovered over the past few days of tiling, but it made me glad that I had that bag of quick setting adhesive after all, as it meant I could finish the job with only a couple of hours of delay rather than a couple of days. I want to re-emphasise how satisfying the grouting was. It magically turned the floor from looking like something delicate to something super solid with the wipe of a sponge. I've long been a believer that imperfections are where the personality lies, and in this context, it is what makes it a real porcelain tile floor and not just a roll of linoleum. Determined to play on hard mode, we weren't done with the tiling still, because we wanted to install a tile skirting board too. I managed to get the same tiles as the floor, but bigger and thicker, which I then cut in half to make the skirting. Unfortunately, the thicker tiles were much more angry to cut. And despite ordering what I thought was a generous 25% overage, I ended up breaking so many of them that I ran out before I could finish the job. What I could finish though looks really good, and made the last week of waiting extra tedious. But I made sure all the paint was touched up in the meantime, and even whipped together another funky shaped piece of wood to make a nice light use windowsill to go on the other wall of the porch. The tiles did eventually show up though, and my success rate with them was similarly low. But I just managed to get the 2 extra pieces I needed to complete the job.
Woo!
And completing it was really rewarding. It looks really good. We're both really happy with how the porch has turned out now.
It's really helpful, Frisbee.
It's tempting to call the job done now, but I still plan to replace the glazing on the internal door at some point, which will be an adventure of its own. Thanks for watching my video.